All right, we're live. Hey, everyone. Sorry for that. You were looking at one of our guests, Heather Hendershot there. This is Mike Jansen. I'm with Current, and just letting you know that we are going to get started in just a few minutes here. We're going to let you watch the rest of what you've been seeing, which is a, sorry for that. You were looking at one of our guests, Heather Hendershot there, which was a look back at 50 years of Firing Line. We're going to wrap up that video in just a few minutes. Then we're going to come back. I'm going to introduce the show and let you know what we'll be talking about today. And then we'll watch a Firing Line excerpt and go from there. So it's great to have you along, and I'll be back with you in just a moment.
I want to say no to China when it subsidizes genocide in Cambodia on a scale that has not been known in this century, rather than simply forget that it is.
All right, and we're back. Hi, everyone. It's great to have you here. I'm Mike Jansen. I'm digital editor at Current. If you're not familiar with Current, we are the trade publication for public and nonprofit media. And I'm joining you today from our offices in Tacoma Park, Maryland. This is the first installment in Get With the Program, a series of monthly screenings looking back at iconic and historically significant public TV shows. We're putting on these screenings as part of our commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the Public Broadcasting Act. Keep an eye on our website, current.org, over the coming months for more of our special 50th anniversary features. So we're using a platform called OVEE for today's screening, or OVEE. I've actually noticed the creators of it tend to emphasize the V, not the O. So OVEE. It's a virtual theater that allows you to watch together and chat live with friends, fans, and experts. So let's get started. So our first Get With the Program event today is about William F. Buckley's Firing Line. Now, this is a show that aired on television for 33 years, and 28 years of those were on public TV. And the host, William F. Buckley, brought a conservative viewpoint to the show and to public television. But his wide range of guests spanned all kinds of political views, and it wasn't Buckley's goal to shout them down on the show, as I think you'll see today. He actually listened to his guests, and often on the show, you hear more from his guests than you do from him. Politicians, writers, thinkers, celebrities of all stripes appeared on the show over its 33-year run. Groucho Marx, Margaret Thatcher, Muhammad Ali, Huey Newton, Ronald Reagan, the list goes on. Presidents, writers, athletes, entertainers, all kinds. They joined Buckley on his bare bones set for in-depth, unscripted discussions, something that was rare during its time, and it remains so today. So I hope you'll learn more about it as we watch today. So to help us learn about how and why Firing Line got to public TV and the impact that it had, we have two guests with us today. We have Heather Hendershot. She is author of Open to Debate, How William F. Buckley Put Liberal America on the Firing Line. Hi, Heather. How's it going?
Hi, how are you, Mike?
Good. Heather is a professor in MIT's Department of Comparative Media Studies and Writing. She studies conservative media and political movements, film and television genres, and American film history. And for 5 years, she was the editor of Cinema Journal, the official publication of the Society for Cinema and Media Studies. Heather is joining us today from Medford, Massachusetts. And coming to us from Columbia, South Carolina is Henry Coffin. Hi, Henry. How are you doing?
I do. Very good, Mike. Thank you.
Good. It's great to have you here. Henry was instrumental in bringing Firing Line to public television, so it's great to have him here, and he's going to tell us about how that happened. Henry began with South Carolina ETV, the public broadcasting network for South Carolina, when it was just an experiment in a high school in Columbia, South Carolina. Under his leadership, it grew to a network of 11 television stations, 9 FM radio stations, and a 32-channel nationwide satellite system. He served on many of broadcasting's boards and commissions. Appointment by President Nixon to the National Endowment for the Arts, the Carnegie Commission for the Future of Public Broadcasting. He was originally appointed to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting Board by President Bush and then reappointed by President Clinton. And in 1994, he was elected chairman of the board of CPB. Henry retired from SCETV in 1998. Also, many thanks today to the Hoover Institution for allowing us to use the excerpts from Firing Line that you will see today. So we'd be glad to answer any questions that you might have during the screening. We invite you to type questions and comments into the chat box that you can see on your screen. And you can also use the emoticons under the video player while you are watching and listening. So we're going to get started with interviewing Henry and Heather in a little more depth in a few minutes here, but let's get started by watching a clip from the show. And also, we've posted our first poll question that I'd like you to answer if you haven't already. Have you ever watched Firing Line? I admit I actually had not seen a lot of the show until I needed to get ready for this, and it's been very interesting to learn about. But how familiar is the audience that we have today with this show? Let's find out about that. So look for that question in a moment. Or actually, I'm sorry, it's already up there in our chat window. And we'll talk about the answers when we get back from this excerpt. So here's a clip to give you a sense of what Firing Line was like. This is from the show's early days in 1968, but not a lot about the show changed over more than its 3 decades on public television. So this is Allen Ginsberg, the poet and kind of social provocateur, appearing on Firing Line in 1968. He introduces a chant, a Hare Krishna chant, that we're going to start in the middle of here because it goes on for a bit. I don't know that you need to hear the whole chant, really. And earlier in this episode, he has read Buckley a poem that he had written under the influence of LSD. So it's a pretty interesting episode overall. So let's watch this. It's about 5 minutes, and then we're going to come back and talk about the show. Started?
That was the most unhurried Krishna I ever heard. Well, you armed 500,000 Americans with little tiny $15 harmoniums and sent them in to get gone. You'd probably get better results. Well, it's a matter of practical, unnaive politics. You mean by contrast with the president? Well, by contrast with
What's up?
bring down fear, bad feelings.
Hey, Mike.
Move over.
Mike,
Yeah.
since we can't see the clips, can you turn up the volume maybe so we can at least hear?
I don't know if that would work because of my headphones.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry that you have to kind of be in the dark on this part, but it's to avoid the feedback problem that
Gotcha.
occurs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I got to watch them all ahead except the Navasky, so which I've seen before, but
Okay, I can let you know when we're about like 30 seconds toward the end.
Okay.
Something.
That's great.
Where do you want this?
Set me up for arrest by the New York Narcotics Bureau for my political speech against the marijuana illegalization laws. How do you know? Well, a friend of mine, Hunky, who's an old time deputy from way back. Yeah. And a very interesting literary figure. And he appears in Kerouac occasionally. was busted in New York a couple years ago, and the police threatened to throw the book at him unless he brought some pot to my apartment, so that they could, under the Rockefeller no-knock law, bust into my apartment and bust me. Oh, he called my brother the lawyer, and I went and complained to my representative, Congressman Washington, Congressman Jolson from Madison, Representative Kennedy's office. Had a story in the Times about it, a story in the Washington Post. And finally, I had enough, like, energy to run around to protect myself by making enough stink about it. The same, the detectives involved with that was a Detective Imp in New York, who was later busted for pushing jump. It was that. So there's hope for everybody. Well, no, it's hopeless unless the public realizes that, for instance, in this area of narcotics, drugs, marijuana, the police have been acting illegally all along, and the police has been running a police state in that area, which is causing immense social damage.
You mean acting illegally by what? By not running people in who, in fact, are violating the law?
Well, the police themselves have been peddling a lot of dope in New York, particularly. There was a whole series in the New York Times dealing with that. From
At the instructions of Cardinal Spellman?
Well, now I don't know what Cardinal Spellman was on. No, I presume Spellman was not. I think probably Spellman was like very much morally against people smoking pot unless they do damage to themselves socially, and so he would prefer that they go to jail.
No, I do think that
you know how many people are in jail for pot now?
People, you have to pay little attention to what it is that you say. It's rather reckless. Rather more.
No.
These sort of categorical definitions.
About the Narcotics Bureau in New York?
You can find police who are crooks. You can find popes who are crooks.
But the whole Narcotics Bureau. Shake up in police shift 3 top aides in Narcotics Union, February 17, 1968. Sudden removal of Chief Inspector Bluth and his 2 top assistants stunned many police officers at the headquarters. Said it was the most dramatic shakeup they could remember in the Bureau.
So what?
Last December 13th, 3 detectives of the Bureau's Special Investigating Unit were indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of selling narcotics to peddlers. The trial date is not being set.
Now, wait a minute.
2 city detectives,
wait a
one of
minute,
whom
wait a
was
minute.
indicted this week by a federal grand jury on charges of selling drugs, were charged in a civil lawsuit yesterday with stealing $2,783 from a suspect during a heroin raid. March 7th, 2 captains, a lieutenant, and a sergeant were transferred out of the police department's narcotics bureau for pushing.
I think we have maybe a minute or so, maybe a little less. It's kind of hard to tell from the way this video works.
Everybody recognizes what just happened. It's not about reading a headline about somebody very high up. He said it twice. Chief Inspector, get that, Chief Inspector, you see. He gets fired. And then you get down to the end of the story, you find that 3 detectives have been caught selling drugs. So he invites you to assume that the Chief Inspector was very likely implicated in the selling of this drug, whereas a much more reasonable implication is that he was precisely fired because he didn't catch these people sooner. So therefore, your attempt simply to reason that the whole fraternity is involved in this.
As the department continues to investigate charges that the Bureau is riddled with corruption.
All right, and there you have it, Allen Ginsberg appearing on Firing Line. Like the comments we were getting in the chat window there, it really is just such an interesting thing to see how this show looks and how casual people are. And in case you didn't catch it, that crack of William F. Buckley's after the Krishna chant ended was, "That's the most unhurried Krishna I've ever heard." And he obviously looked fairly satisfied with himself for that one. The bell there at the end was signaling a commercial break. That was a commercial episode. And it was before it started airing on public TV in 1971. Some of the clips that we're watching today are from Firing Line's commercial days. But there's really basically no difference in the show between its time on commercial and PBS other than those breaks that I can see. And it's visually and as far as how the show ran, it's pretty much the same otherwise. But we'll see some of both today, the commercial and the public. So let's turn to our guests and talk a little more about this show in more depth. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself here. I should go back and take a look at the responses to our poll now that you've had some chance, a little bit of a chance to respond. Most of the people watching today who answered have not seen Firing Line when it was on public TV or didn't watch it at the time. We have 12 responses no and 4 yes. So I think we're all learning a bit today. So Heather Hendershot is author of Open to Debate, How William F. Buckley Put Liberal America on the Firing Line. And Heather, to start with, why did you want to write a book about this show?
Well, the book I wrote before was about Cold War right-wing broadcasting. And so these were the sort of extremist, hard right folks who emerged after Barry Goldwater was defeated in 1964, and they were particularly adamant about preventing the Civil Rights Act from happening and pushing back the civil rights movement. And they were conspiratorial. The people like John Birch Society, who thought that the fluoridation of water was a communist conspiracy, that kind of thing. And these were the sort of kooks that Buckley had to, with others, but had to sort of push out of the movement, out of the conservative movement, to make it more legitimate. So as I'm studying these right-wing extremists, Buckley seems, he emerges as the really interesting, intelligent conservative voice who's trying to redefine conservatism. And I started watching Firing Line right as I was finishing that book and realized, wow, this is a great story. The story of how he did this, how his TV show sort of was a compass and a steering wheel at the same time of the conservative movement for 33 years, and how it functioned as an alternative voice to people like the Birchers.
And you say in your book that Firing Line is arguably the greatest public affairs show that is aired on TV. What do you think about it sets it apart?
Well, some of the things you said in your introduction, the fact that Buckley was willing to sit back and really listen to his guests. I think the fact that the show is much more of a conversation than an interview. So today, we're lucky if we get an interview, just people talking without shouting at each other. Mostly we get shouting matches, right? That's a lot of what's on TV, and certainly talk radio is very one-sided. But here you had a show that was just a conversation between people who really, really disagree with each other. And sometimes they got a little hostile. Sometimes they were hostile onset, but friendly offset. He was very good friends, for example, with the leftist Harvard economist John Kenneth Galbraith, and they took ski vacations together, in Switzerland. But they were on the show fighting all the time and arguing about economics. And so there was a kind of gentility to the show, I suppose, even as sometimes it got a little bit rough and tumble. And I really think, ultimately that's what makes it so great, is it's a sort of model for how left and right could have a conversation, listen, and possibly change each other's minds, possibly not. But there was always the option that the audience members could change their minds, that the show wasn't just speaking to the choir the way that, say, Fox tends to speak just to conservatives or MSNBC tends to speak just to liberals. This show was aggressively kind of speaking to both camps. And I think that's a lot of the value of the show lies exactly in that.
Yeah, and I think one thing we'll see in these excerpts is that sometimes he would let his guests talk mostly and not even really say that much himself. And so it's not like he was really pushing some kind of conservative agenda and trying to get his points across all the time. He wanted to have other people, let other people have a say.
He hoped that people would watch the show and change their minds if they were liberal. He's particularly wanted to speak to conservative or to liberal youth and try to get them, more on the conservative side. But he also felt, certainly with some liberals or leftists he had on the show, he was like, okay, this person might actually talk themselves into a corner because he had such confidence in his own position. So if he had someone, say, from the Black Panther Party on, like Huey P. Newton or Eldridge Cleaver, he would debate with them for a while. But at a certain point, some of the more aggressive figures would just sort of take over the conversation. And he thought, okay, well, I'll just let them speak and my viewers can decide whether or not they, agree with them. And the viewer mail he got seemed to really appreciate that too. And often the studio audience was even with the guests, like Buckley says that Eldridge Cleaver is, Huey P. Newton, he says what he's saying is very confusing and this kind of thing. And the audience during the Q&A at the end says, oh, I understood exactly what he was talking about, Mr. Buckley. I don't know what your problem is, but he's very eloquent and very sophisticated, So he was willing to just let the conversation run that way if that's how things went. Instead of today, a host like Bill O'Reilly would have said, cut off his mic if he didn't like what he was saying, but he was willing to really let people talk.
Yeah, I really liked how in that clip with Ginsburg, he's trying to get him to stop talking, and he's just being so gentle about it. He's like, hey.
He would often say, Buckley would often say, you know, well, I appreciate your beliefs and I understand that you genuinely believe them. However, you know, I mean, he thinks he's totally wrong, but he's showing like, yes, I do respect, you know, you as a thinker. I understand that you're sincere. I sincerely believe that you are wrong. Right.
Right.
And, you know, there's a moment with Huey P. Newton where Newton is just talking and talking and talking. And Buckley finally performs the firing line equivalent of throwing in the towel. He puts down his clipboard, just acknowledging, I'm never going to get a word in edgewise here, and I'm just going to let this guy go.
Right, right. Well, Henry, tell us about, you know, in its early days and when you became involved with it, what was the show like in terms of other things that you could see on TV? I mean, we're talking about how it's different now, but back then, did it stand out also?
Oh, yes. The program really still stands out in the history of broadcasting as the finest program of its type. There really is nothing that's ever approached it or matched it in its style and what it tried to do and what it tried to do successfully. So yes, the program was something that was desperately needed on broadcasting, not just on public broadcasting, but on broadcasting itself. And we saw an opportunity to fill a need, which was to get some liberal programming matched up with some really talented conservative programs. And we could not have found a better program than Firing Line and William F. Buckley. It's just a match that really, in South Carolina and in the southern region of the country, the programming from NET and GBH that consisted mostly of everything that was on public broadcasting at that time was either liberal or ultra liberal. And it didn't exactly match the needs of our particular audience. We had an association in the southern part of the country, located in headquartered in Columbia, that reached from Virginia to Texas, similar to the EEN, which was an association of all the stations. And we had almost 98 stations, which was about a third of the country. And it gave us the potential of getting into the program production process for the country, for PBS. And we use that.
What was the name of that organization?
SECA, S-E-C-A, SECA, Southern Educational Communications Association.
Right, and for people who are in public media now, it later became
NETA.
NETA, right?
National.
National Education Telecommunications Association,
Right,
which is still around today. Yeah,
it's still around today, yes, and it has become much more powerful and much covering much more of the needs of public broadcasting than EEN, which was just focused on the programming for PBS. SECA, NETA, covers education programming and a whole range of things like that. So SECA, we were able to go to Buckley. I went to Buckley. After we took a look at a Firing Line, I said, wow, we've got to get this program. And so I called up Buckley and asked him if he would see me. And I went up there. I had a map of the country showing where the public broadcasting stations in SECA were. And I told him that we had 93 stations, which are about a third of all the stations in the country. And they were committed to supporting Firing Line if it came to public broadcasting. And I pointed out that, you know, here you are, you get 42 minutes in an hour on commercial broadcasting with all the commercials that come in. You get 57 minutes if you come to public broadcasting. That kind of tweaked his interest a little. And he told me along the way, he said, you know, I don't support the idea of the government paying for programming through public television. I said, I understand that, Mr. Buckley, but this is an opportunity. He said, well, as long as it's there, I might as well use it.
Right, and use it, he did.
Yeah.
Right. And so I made my presentation and he said, I'll think about it. And a couple of weeks later, I got a call from Warren Steibel. He said, how would you like to do a debate at the Cambridge Union with Jermaine Greer? And I said, well, that would be good. I said, what are you looking for from us? Money? He said, yeah. And so
And he was Buckley's producer, is that right? Steibel?
Steibel, uh-huh.
He was Buckley's producer?
He was Buckley's producer for the entirety of his broadcasting firing line. And Buckley was a very liberal person, which tells you a little bit about Buckley. They were great friends, but that ensured that the program would not be shifted off to just a conservative program, because Warren kept him in the middle of the line there.
Right. Interesting. Well, we'll talk a little more about the role that the show played in public TV after we watch another clip. So let's, because we have a couple that we want to get through. I do want to mention, and I see this already happening, that you all are welcome to ask questions in the chat box, and then we'll toss those to Henry and Heather throughout the interview today. So when we come back from the next clip, I'll make sure to get a few of your questions to them. So let's next up watch something that would be appropriate today, because given how often we're hearing Watergate mentioned with current events as they are. Here are Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward on Firing Line in 1974, and they were talking with Buckley about their reporting on Nixon and on Watergate, originating from the Washington Post.
Mike?
All right, it's one. Is it? There we go. Yep.
Oh, I was just going to say it'd be great if I could follow up just for a minute when we get back on what Henry was saying about the move to PBS and how valuable that was for the show.
Yeah, definitely.
Just a minute on that, because I think it was, so you can really save them in a lot of ways. Yeah,
let's hear about that. Yeah. Okay. All right, I'm going to watch the clip here.
You're doing good, Granddaddy. That sounds good.
That's illegal. I don't think the reporter will even have to report
Do you need anything else? Are you okay on drinks and everything? Or do you need anything else?
No, okay. Good shape.
I think that like anybody else, we have yet. I think we really prize our ability to catch ourselves in a couple of stories, very much as a juror does. A juror might have, and if he gets in the jury box, he becomes the person who's interested in facts and evidence.
Speaking of tactics, let me quote your book. You came in with a piece of evidence. There's at least one difference that says you stand Mitchell, Ehrlich, Bradley's eyes, right, did a little dance, holding the magnet out to his ass, wiggling it back and forth for walking apart. Is that typical of the tactic?
I think that in deciding to write this book of journalism, how one newspaper works, I decided to tell all. Sometimes the exuberance of the moment. This was during the period that suffered really a series of attacks, the strident attacks on the White House, really denying our stories, calling us characters. practitioner down in here. They work very much. They respond.
Has to do more with our own credibility than taking any joy in the guilt of others.
Well, but there is a certain prosecutorial feel in the story, isn't there, that is by no means confined to Washington Post. I detected sometimes in national reviews.
Is a columnist for the Washington. I don't think so. At least, as Carl was saying, quickly learn that in the newspaper business, it does not serve your interest to put inaccurate information in the paper or information that has a political twist to it.
I think when you talk about being prosecutorial, a prosecutor presents one side of the case and only one side of the case, whereas I think that throughout the Washington Post coverage, as well as other newspapers, both sides of the case have been presented. I mean, anytime we put any kind of allegation in the paper, the first thing we do is go to the person who we're writing about and say, you know, what about this? Is this right? And certainly there have been numerous occasions when people have told us, no, you're off base. Here's why. We've held back. We've kept it out of the paper. And indeed, if somebody, you know, can show us that we're wrong, we wouldn't put it.
Well, I understand that. And if, for instance, Deep Throat gave you a tape recording tomorrow, which absolutely established Nixon's innocence, you would certainly run it as a story.
Yes, indeed.
But there would be a general sense of deflation.
Maybe a minute to go.
I don't think so, because we try to spend as much time looking at their side of the story. Often the White House conversations about certain allegations consist of saying the sources of the Washington Post are a fountain of misinformation, and leave it at that, and they would go no further. Sometimes they will engage in a somewhat constructive dialogue, and we try to do that. But the story has gone way beyond what we ever really wrote, predicted, or had any notion of. We have no real stake in an eventual outcome of establishing the guild of the president.
You mean as individuals?
As individual, as an institution, I think the Washington
Reporting
Post
isn't about this, establishing guilt.
You are a wise man. You're intelligent.
All right, got a little bit of Muhammad Ali there, but that's okay. We'll go to that next. So there were Woodward and Bernstein on Firing Line. The hair, the ties, there was a lot of conversation going on in the chat box there about the look and also smoking on the set, which is pretty great, and something that Ginsburg was doing too. It's just, wow, that was something that happened on TV. So actually, let's start off with a question from Julie. She asked in the chat box, Heather, did you analyze guests based on race and gender?
I organized the book around the big social movements, really from the 60s up to the Reagan election in 1980. And so there's a chapter on the women's liberation movement and how the show dealt with it. There's a chapter on civil rights and Black power. There's a chapter on anti-communism, and then chapters on Reagan and Nixon. And so I didn't, I approached guests in terms of, race and gender based on, which chapters they fit in, and Buckley's particular approach to issues of racism and sexism and feminism and other social movements.
But did you do any, I'm kind of guessing Julie might have been asking, did you do any sort of look at like X% of guests were male, X% were female, X% were white?
Yeah, that's I didn't get that. That was the tilt of the question. Most of the guests were white males. I mean, there was a dominance of that. And I don't have exact numbers, I would guess probably 65% about white male, and there are quite a few African Americans on the show over the years, political figures, activists, and so on, and fewer women. Claire Booth Luce was on the show a fair number of times, who was a conservative and a good friend of Buckley's. Germaine Greer, who Henry mentioned a minute ago, was also on the show. Betty Friedan. You know, a number of women. But since Buckley tended towards elected officials and so on from the 60s and 70s and really into the 80s, you know, there was a white male dominance there. He also had a lot of journalists on the show, and that tended to be dominated by white male figures over the years.
Yeah, it did seem to me, just looking through the options for Eclipse, very, very male.
Yeah, that's true.
But maybe no worse, and Julie says, maybe no worse than what you would have seen on any public TV show at that.
Oh, in fact, much better, I would say. I
Really?
mean, I think he had more women and people of color on the show than the typical news or public affairs show at the time, because he really wanted to cover these movements. I mean, keep in mind that in the late 60s, early 70s, Nixon had strongly encouraged the networks to stop covering Black Power. He just wanted to pretend like it didn't exist. And Buckley was like, no, I'm going to have them on the show. And of course, from a, you know, a perspective of trying to show why they were wrong and so on. But the best coverage you could get on Black Power to a certain movement was certainly on Firing Line, and arguably the best coverage of feminism, the women's liberation movement, because the news covered it in a very cursory manner. It was only about the ERA, and it was just a very slim kind of coverage, like, oh, well, feminists want to eliminate sex segregated bathrooms. That's all they care about. You know, there wasn't like a deep probe into what feminism was all about. And Firing Line was doing that better than other public affairs shows that were out there.
And you said that you wanted to follow up on what Henry was saying about public broadcasting's role with the show.
Yeah, I did. Henry told us a great story about kind of making a pitch to Buckley about, you know, if you're on PBS, you get 57 minutes instead of 42 minutes, and look at the great coverage we have of the country. And Buckley said, well, I don't know about government funded television. I'll get back to you. And it's true that he was very skeptical about PBS in general. He was delighted when Reagan defunded PBS in the 80s. He sent exuberant letters out to his constituents saying, yay, we're being defunded. Please send us money so we can keep going. And he had no problem getting funding for the show. It was fine. So yeah, he was a little skeptical, but I think he was probably playing his cards a little close to his chest with Henry if he was implying, well, I'm just not really sure about this, because he was having difficulties being on RKO. That was the old movie company, was his syndicator before he went to PBS. And RKO scheduled him very sporadically. It was difficult. It was on independent stations all over the country, and he would be in a choice spot for a while, and then literally the day after he won an Emmy for the show, the next day they moved the show to Sunday morning. And Buckley wrote them an angry letter saying, you know, it's Sunday morning when all respectable people are either in church or golfing. And it was probably the nicest. He didn't really like golf. It was the nicest thing he probably ever said about golfing. But the point was, you know, what are you thinking, you idiots? And so PBS was a sort of life raft for him, offering the show stability in terms of scheduling. And as Henry pointed out, more time, you know, closer to an hour rather than 40 minutes. And importantly, now, Mike, you noted in the introduction how the format hadn't changed much over the years. And that's basically true. They mixed it up a bit. They would have a moderator in, or they'd, you know, change the seating around a little bit. They tried to mix it up a little, but it was pretty much two guys sitting on a platform talking most of the time. But before it went to PBS, there were these constant commercial interruptions. And we heard in one of the clips this ding dong kind of doorbell that they would interrupt with. And guests would sometimes literally jump on the stage, right? The audience members didn't like it. People wrote letters saying, this is silly, you know? And it interrupted the flow of the conversation in a really dramatic way. And a show like this that was about long form conversation and very intellectual needed to not be interrupted by commercials. And that was something that PBS brought to Firing Line that was really, and Sika, that was really, really important.
Did the show air at the same time on all the stations that carried it, or did it kind of vary in its scheduling?
Well, certainly under RKO, it was highly variable, and I'm guessing there was a little more stability once it went to PBS, but still those would have been locally controlled choices, I think, in terms of scheduling. You know, it's funny when you look at schedules from the 70s, like the early 70s, and Henry was saying how the PBS and NET before it were really, really liberal and ultra liberal. And it's true, you see a lot of liberal programming, and Buckley sort of stands out. But the thing that you see scheduled over and over again is actually Julia Child's The French Chef. And so there was definitely, there's a handful of extremely popular, politically, I think, very neutral kind of programming out there too, that the local stations are pushing heavily. And people love to rewatch, you know, They love to rewatch Firing Line, so it would be rerun a couple times a week. And they'd love to rewatch The French Chef because there were no VCRs and stuff, and you had to write down the recipes.
Wow, I didn't think about that. Yeah. Pre-YouTube, you had to actually remember what you were supposed to cook.
It was hard to watch a cooking show without taking a lot of notes. Yeah.
Well, we actually may have French Chef as a future screening in this series.
Oh, super!
So,
that would be great.
Yeah, join us for that.
I'd love to.
Henry, for stations, do you know if it, brought significant audience, or did that really matter to stations that were carrying it? Henry?
Oh, excuse me. I thought you were still talking to Heather.
I was worried your headphones weren't working.
Yes, it got very good audiences, particularly in our region, but of course all over the country. There was no other program like it, so it stood apart from all the rest. And through public broadcasting, it really reached the kind of audiences that Buckley was trying to talk to better than through commercial broadcasting, which was looking more for entertainment. So moving to public broadcasting, I think, was really the proper place for Firing Line. But Buckley was just an extraordinary personality, and you could just watch him without even listening to the program and enjoy it. But I remember one time one of his guests said, I hated what you just said, but I loved the way you said it.
He was definitely had a disarming wit, and also self-deprecating when he needed to be. It's like for every kind of crack he would make at someone else's expense, he would then turn around and say something, kind of putting himself down in a playful way. So he kind of played that well, I thought, in the clips that I've watched. It's also interesting to read about another role that the show played for public TV, which was, as you were talking about a little bit before, Henry, it presented it looked like it was an attempt to balance what some might see as liberal programming. And Heather, there's an anecdote in your book about how it did that, where Newton Minow was chairman of PBS in the late 70s, and you say that he noticed that stations were dropping the show. Could you tell us about why they were dropping the show and how he responded to that?
Basically, he noted that funding had been dropped for Firing Line, and he immediately jumped on that and said, you cannot drop our flagship programming, conservative programming, right? He recognized like there's a liberal slant to PBS, and this show is really important for trying to sort of balance out what we offer to viewers. And he immediately nipped that in the bud. And then he, I believe, if I remember the story correctly, he went to Walter Annenberg and asked him for money, and Annenberg gave him, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, millions of dollars, and a chunk of that went towards subsidizing Firing Line. So it did continue on the air. It was never profitable in any way, and it's worth emphasizing that. I mean, I guess that's generally true of most PBS programming, with exception of maybe, I don't know, Sesame Street having product tie-ins and stuff. But Firing Line was never super highly rated. It never turned a lot of money over, and Buckley had no problem with that. He was the biggest free market capitalist around, and he was like, yeah, of course the show doesn't make a profit. I mean, you don't expect the Catholic Church to make a profit, he said at one point. And in point of fact, the Catholic Church is doing just fine. But his point was that there are certain institutions that perform a public good, and it's not about profit, and he felt that Firing Line was like that. In fact, he once said, from the beginning, our ratings were exiguous, which is just classic Buckley. It means scanty or meager, but he wouldn't say that. He said, they were exiguous, and he was kind of proud of that. The point is that it was sort of niche programming that politically engaged liberals and conservatives would watch, but that wasn't necessarily the mass audience that wanted to watch stuff like, Gunsmoke or The Lucy Show or whatever on network TV.
Yeah, I think your book also has the story about they tried to get him to change the sets or make the show look a little more lively visually. And what did he say? That was it Solzhenitsyn?
Yeah, this was late in the game, and of course the show went till 1999. And so Neil Friedman, who had been one of the very earliest producers of the show before it went to PBS, before Lorraine Steibel took over. So Friedman had become a successful PBS producer in his own right, and he takes Buckley out to lunch, and they have a few martinis and talk. And basically, he had been asked, could you ask Buckley to change the format? He could just add some clips, some cutaways, something to liven it up visually. So Friedman finally approaches this suggestion, and Buckley according to the story, it's almost a too perfect story, but he literally whips a letter from Alexander Solzhenitsyn out of his pocket, opens it up. Solzhenitsyn says, you know, and I can't do a Solzhenitsyn accent, but you know, yours is the best show on television. It's the only show I watch. It's really quite wonderful. Keep up the good work, something like that. And Buckley puts down the letter and says, well, if it's good enough for Solzhenitsyn, it's good enough for me. And that's it. So, you know, not changing the formatting.
The audience of one that really matters. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
All right, well, let's go back to a clip so that, you know, we have about half an hour to go. I was thinking we'd go till about 2:15, and I'd like to watch at least 1 or 2 more clips. So let's go to the Muhammad Ali clip that we actually saw just a second of, but you'll pick up on it just fine when we give it a start. This one's pretty interesting. To set this up, they had been discussing Elijah Muhammad, the head of Nation of Islam. And at the time, Muhammad Ali was, you know, very devoted to the Nation of Islam and to Elijah Muhammad. And Buckley is kind of challenging him on that, as you're going to see. So this is one of the more heated exchanges, and it's pretty interesting to see them go toe-to-toe in a figurative sense on the stage. So let's go to that now, and we'll come back and continue the discussion. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box, and we'll get to them when we return.
You are a wise man. You're an intelligent man. And if I was not a Muslim,
I like this conversation with Ali. This one's really interesting.
I can talk to you for 2 minutes. I would like to have an intelligent conversation with you. But it all comes from the honorable Elijah Muhammad. People praise me. Well, you should be the leader. Well, you don't have to follow Elijah. No, you fool. Everything I got comes from it. He taught me who I was. He made me proud. He made me fearless. He made me love my own. I've turned down millions of people. The beautiful name Muhammad Ali. I now have 56 Muslim invitations by the government. All they ask me about when I go to those countries, how's Elijah Muhammad? White people, twice a day, 65 and 70, their bus stopped in front of Elijah Muhammad's house, hoping to get a glimpse of it. And you cannot destroy me like you have other big ministers of his in the past by telling us, oh, you speak good, you should be the leader. See, this is to get me thinking that I'm smart. And as soon as I leave Elijah, you can get me. But as long as I stay with Elijah Muhammad, I'm safe. And if Malcolm X has stayed with the man that made him great, taught him everything he knew, today he's been big, big, big. But as soon as, in other words, how can I come to your son and say you are wrong for spanking him, and you fed him, you clothed him, you gave him his name, you birthed him in the world? Who am I to come in and be the judge and say, why did you spank that boy? You taught him, you have a right to spank him. And Malcolm X did some things. He said something about Kennedy he should have said. 130 whites died tragically on his death. He praised it. And I'll be like, not the kind of man who ordained it. So he had to spank him. And after you white people had told him how good he talked, he should be the leader, he couldn't take the spanking. He had to run out and start in the movement, and that's when he destroyed it. So I would say whites destroyed Malcolm X.
I understand what you say. I understand what you say, and I no doubt either the sincerity or the eloquence of your tribute to Elijah Muhammad, but I do think that assuming that we are prepared to question the divinity of Elijah Muhammad, then one has to assume that somebody like Malcolm X, that he came against him, might have been doing so for honest, sincere reasons. That is to say, he might have thought, well, I've been following this man for a number of years, but all of a sudden, I have reached a level of understanding which permits me to see he's pretty human after all, and that beyond a certain point, he doesn't have anything.
Always known that he's human, and not having nothing to teach him.
Some people treat him as though he were divine.
He's dead, and we don't talk about dead people. They're dead, they go.
Who's dead?
Yeah. And we follow down Elijah Muhammad. He is the boss. And we'd rather not to stay here on the show and waste a lot of time arguing about a dead black man when whites are accommodating.
Well, I no doubt, of course, he teaches you that, and no doubt you understand.
We don't have to teach him. We don't have to teach a black man that white is his enemy.
Well, you see, from my point of view, what Elijah Muhammad is doing to you is diseasing your mind. You sit and tell me that we white people like to divide and
America.
You do.
I grew up as a white child. I heard much more talk against Democrats than I did against black people. And I grant there's a lot of division in the sense that Republicans are
The
divided.
Democrats and the Republicans don't lynch each other, castrate each other,
Oh,
burn
yes,
each other,
they do.
charge and cut each other, and rape and slave
Oh,
for
they-
400 years.
Now wait a minute. This is.
I would
one
like to
of
ask
the-
you a
this is
question.
one
I'd
of
like
the
to ask you a
difficulties.
question. 22 million black people in America. Who would you say our everyday common enemy is? What other country, what nationality? I mean, you know, you have the nerve to be on a TV show like
I think
this and
they-
look at me like I'm wrong for saying Elijah Muhammad is poisoning me by telling you that you're your enemy. And I feel it and see it every day. And every black man watching this show know you are enemy. And you have the nerve to stand up there and say Elijah Muhammad is poisoning my mind. He cannot teach us that you are enemy. You taught us. And your people daily. Martin Luther King is bumped off unjustly. Adam Clayton Powell is bumped off unjustly. They took my title unjustly. They killed Megan Ever unjustly. All the integrators who love white folks was unjustly kicked out of Washington. They've been deprived of education and poverty throughout the country. They just came back from Vietnam, 12 boys in Chicago, and they sat on the television and they told how white soldiers are teaching Viet Cong to hate them. They fly rebel communist flags, and they doing everything that
Maybe about a minute.
right there in Vietnam. And you can tell people you like this is ladies' newspaper.
Now wait a minute.
Ladies' newspaper. Mohammed Speaks. Now it's full of truth. You put the paper in every city. You can buy Mohammed Speaks. Wise man, but I don't think you're too much wiser than the ones who run the White House.
Much wiser. But
No.
let me.
Buckley gave you his favorite passage. Now I'll give.
All right, and we are back.
Buckley gave you his favorite passage. Now I'll give.
And so that was Muhammad Ali there discussing race and the Nation of Islam with Buckley. And all right, and we are back. Heather, I wanted to talk to you about. You told me when we were discussing clips to use for this screening, you mentioned that one and said that it was an episode where Buckley later said he felt that he did not get the best of Ali, and it was one of the few episodes where he felt like he sort of lost the discussion.
Yeah, that's true. In fact, he showed a clip from the Muhammad Ali episode on the very last episode of Firing Line, and it was a kind of greatest hit sort of compilation on that last episode. And Buckley said to his guests on that final episode, you know, a week or two after the show, Ali was at a press conference and he said, I KO'd Buckley. And then Buckley said, and he was right. And he was very sincere in saying that Buckley had, or that Ali had sort of won that discussion. And he felt fine about that. He didn't feel, oh no, I was bested by Ali. He basically, what happened was he went into the conversation with Ali, assuming that Ali was not sincere about his conversion. He, I think, kind of felt that he was feigning this new religious faith to get out of going to Vietnam as a conscientious objector. And by the end of the show, Buckley really felt that Ali's faith was quite genuine and that his feelings about Elijah Muhammad were quite genuine. And he was really sort of won over by Ali, by his style, by his charm. There's a point in the discussion where Buckley asked him a very sort of complicated question in terms of the grammatical constructions and so on and big vocabulary words. And Ali says, wait a minute, you know, I barely graduated from high school, and I think I graduated in part because my teachers were generous with me. So, you know, you can't talk to me quite like that, Mr. Buckley. You have to change the way you talk to me so that I can understand what you're saying. And Buckley was very gracious about it, just like he would be at a dinner party if someone said, you know, I don't eat shrimp. Well, then no one would eat shrimp, you know. He was a gracious, generous person, and so he would bend to the social situation. And so if Ali wanted less complicated kind of questions, he would change his style of discourse a little bit to accommodate that. But at that moment, I think Buckley or Ali had sort of won because he caught him off guard a little bit. And so he, to some extent, had the rhetorical upper hand throughout the rest of the conversation. And you know, the moment you showed was one of the most fraught moments in the show. I mean, Ali is sort of on the edge of his seat, like this when Buckley says, you know, I think he says you've been poisoned by Elijah Muhammad or something like that. It's a sickness or a disease. And Ali just, you know, he kind of wants to punch him at that moment, and he doesn't. You know, he just sits back and talks it through instead. So it's a very interesting, dramatic, kind of stressful show. And then by the end, there's a kind of resolution. And as the closing credits roll, they actually share an Elijah Muhammad newspaper back and forth, and are obviously chatting about it as the credits roll. So it's a lovely episode to watch to get a sense of what Buckley's style was.
And that was a really interesting episode. And I should mention, all of these episodes that we're watching are available in full on YouTube, thanks to the Hoover Institution, which was also very helpful, as I mentioned before, in providing us the clips today. So if you've seen anything that you want to see more of, just search on YouTube for Firing Line and the name of the guest or whatever, and you'll turn it up. And I recommend doing that if you want to see more of these in full, especially the Allen Ginsberg one is, I think, pretty fascinating end to end. The Ali one is really good, but they're all very interesting. Also, just about, you know, as we're getting somewhat towards the end of the screen here, I want to stop and make a quick request. If you're enjoying this, for your support of this series. We are doing these events for free and without sponsors so far. So, you know, maybe Annenberg would like to jump in. Otherwise, we'd really appreciate anything that you could donate in support of Current and get with the program, the series of screenings we're doing here. You can donate at bit.ly/give2current. That's bit.ly/give2current. We're going to put that in the chat box for you to follow as well. And thank you. Speaking of funders and funding, this is actually a question from the audience. Besides the Annenberg Foundation, did the show have any major funders, whether conservative or not?
Well, sir, the Olin Foundation, for the last, I would say maybe 10 years of the show, the Olin Foundation got the most sort of prominent tagline at the end of the show. And then there was the Friends of Firing Line, which basically were the smaller donations from dedicated viewers. I think Helena Rubinstein might have also been one of the companies that heavily supported the show. Henry might know better than I do, but those are some of the big ones.
And were those funders that generally supported conservative causes and conservative programming, or were they more, you know, politically neutral?
Yes, and I think this is something Henry could answer as well. I believe these were funders across PBS who tended to gravitate towards somewhat more conservative programming.
Yeah, that's accurate. Although there were a few exceptions, but essentially they were having a conservative leaning.
Henry, I wanted to ask you, kind of following up on something that you talked about a bit before. Do you think that today public TV needs a firing line in terms of, does it need more conservative balance to the programming that's on? That's been kind of a fraught issue over the years. I mean, especially in the 2000s, there was that period of time when Ken Tomlinson was at CPB, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and was trying to get Tucker Carlson on the air and the Wall Street Journal editorial board, and this kind of blew up into a bit of a scandal for CPB. So it's definitely been something that's come up over the years, and you know, I feel like it's never really a totally settled issue. What do you think today about what's on PBS and how well balanced it is?
Well, I think it's a little better than it was in the early days, but it's still very liberally oriented, at least in my view. And unfortunately, there no longer is a firing line on it. It needs another firing line. They'll never get another Buckley, but they need another program that is in that spirit. And
do either of you have any ideas about why there isn't one? Like, why do we not have a firing line type show today on public TV?
Well, it's a mix. I mean, Henry points to the fact there was only one Buckley, and it's true. How do you do a new firing line without finding just the right charismatic, erudite kind of figure? But the other explanation for the lack of a firing line today has to do with just the nature of the media landscape and how everything is so kind of niche, right? So, you know, there's a channel just for people who are into gardening. There's a channel for people who are into pets. There's a channel for people who are into home improvement. There's, you know, and so it's the same thing with news and public affairs. There's a place to go if you're conservative. There's a place to go if you're liberal. And certainly a lot of talk radio is skewed one way or the other, mostly towards more conservative and in some cases right-wing programming. So it's harder to find a venue that functions as a kind of genuine public sphere, a public commons. You know, the whole old Habermas idea of just people talking in open communication, and their ideas come into conflict and they try to reach a resolution. Where's that going to happen on TV, where everything is so narrowly targeted and people are in kind of echo chambers where they already see and consume programming that already fits their interests or their political backgrounds or needs or desires? And so that makes it very hard for a show to exist that is a, you know, even-handed debate with, you know, a conservative between a liberal, just sort of having a conversation. And so you end up with stuff like Crossfire, which is just people shouting at each other. And it's, you know, it's very entertaining, but it's like cockfighting or bear baiting on some level. You know, it's not, we can do a lot better, I think, on television and on radio.
Yeah, yeah. Something comes to mind. I don't know if either of you have heard, and we had a story on this recently, but WNYC in New York was doing a show called Indivisible, where they actually featured different hosts each night throughout the week, and it was about Trump and the kind of fallout from the election. And one night they even had a conservative talk show host who had previously, I think, been on another radio network or station. And so they were kind of deliberately seeking out that sort of get all the you know, voices both left and right together and have that kind of like open exchange. Because you hear a lot of people saying now, after this most recent election, it's a time when we really do need to be listening and trying to understand the other side, because it just feels so much more divided than it ever has.
Yeah.
Henry, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think clearly the country today and broadcasting today, if you look at what's on the air today, you can clearly see that it's very liberally oriented, particularly on the EEN and those cable services. So the effort to get conservative programming on any broadcasting service has been one that we haven't been terribly successful in. But again, Heather has given a very good outline and feeling for what Firing Line was like, and an understanding for what Bill Buckley was like. You're not going to find another one. So it took a special person to get a conservative view on public broadcasting. That's just the case. And when we first started with public broadcasting with Bill Buckley, my relationship with him was totally professional, but over time, be very good friends. He even wanted me to come on as many programs, trips, especially when he went out of the country, as I could. And of course I did whenever I could. But Buckley was just a special person. And I'm sure he vetted me very carefully before he came with South Carolina ETV. But like I say, we got to be good friends, and I have never found anybody that was more cordial and more interested in what you had to say and what you had to think about, and what he did on the program to a lesser programming stance was what he dealt with his everyday friends. And anytime anybody came on public broadcasting, to Firing Line, that is, they became a member of a small club of people that kept communicating with one another, whether they were totally liberal or very conservative. They always went away friends of Bill Buckley's, and he of them. So it was a unique relationship. It wasn't going to the studio and do the program and leaving. That's the way the guests usually did on most programs. But they always usually stayed a little time, and they had additional conversations, and they would iron out maybe some of the arguments they'd had on the air. So it was interesting to watch that process.
I just wanted to mention the results of our latest poll before we go into another clip. We had asked if a show like Firing Line were on PBS today, would you watch it? We had 10 responses, and 7 of the 10 said definitely. 2 said maybe. So it sounds like there's definitely some interest among our viewers for some more shows like this also. I also wanted to mention that if you'd like to see Henry and Buckley interact, there's an episode of Firing Line that was about public broadcasting and whether public broadcasting should be funded. It was a half-hour episode from its later years. And Henry appears on the show along with Beth Courtney, who was and still is the president of Louisiana Public Broadcasting. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get a version of it to use for an excerpt in this screening, but I'm going to put the link to it here in our chat box, and if you want to watch it, it's worth checking out. There's also a transcript that you can find online if you'd rather read it instead of watch it, but there you go. Well, let's get one more clip in here before we run out of time, and then we'll have a few minutes when we come back just to answer any last questions and to kind of wrap up looking at the current state of things with shows like Firing Line. This one is from 1980. This is Buckley and his guests debating the legacy of McCarthyism. And at the time, Victor Navasky, who's one of the guests here, was the editor of The Nation magazine, and he had written the book Naming Names, which was a book about Senator McCarthy's anti-communist efforts. And Roy Cohn, who also pops up here, had been chief counsel to McCarthy and kind of comes on as a special extra guest on this episode. So let's watch this. We'll come back and talk a bit about it and enjoy it.
Buckley gave you his favorite message. Now I'll give you mine. Talking about these 4 countries who are involved in the particularly talking about who were asked to sign a loyalty oath at a particular time, referring back to the Reagan conversation. He's not going to recommend people who can't say they believe in the free way of life and all that to people. In describing, quoting with approval, the effect that this had on these poor people, we said it caused them, and I quote, worry, depression, fatigue, fear, insomnia, drinking, headache, indigestion. It sounds like an Alka-Seltzer ad or something.
What I'm doing there, as you know, again, as to quote our new president, there, you've done it again, Roy. What I'm doing there is quoting somebody else, as you know. As you'll see, it's within question.
I mean, you didn't put it in here because you disagreed.
But what the whole tenor of these questions, put it in quotes, seems to me is a kind of reflection of the attitude that pervaded that period. It's you cannot talk about witnesses before the Un-American Activities Committee investigation into Hollywood without dragging in Whittaker Chambers and Alger Hiss. You cannot talk about the American Communist Party without talking about an international espionage monolithic conspiracy. Haven't you learned that China and the Soviet Union are not part of an international monolithic conspiracy, that they don't like each other, that they don't like each other? In Mr. Cohn's first question, you go over the whole list. That was the assumption of that question.
No, we were accumulating totalitarianism, and they have a lot in common, including they hang pictures of the same people on the wall: Stalin, Lenin.
But see, you're doing it. You're doing the same thing.
They've got at least that much in common.
Right. You're doing the same thing, Bill. See, here's what I object to. What I object to is, and I was very careful in the book, I think, to identify it and to discuss it in this way, that if you try to put the Hollywood blacklist or Joe McCarthy into the context of Stalinism, then of course you say Stalin is the greater evil, because Stalin sent 20 million people, or however many, to the salt mines and to the slave labor camps and to their death, whereas McCarthy was responsible for putting away only a few hundred. Of course, Stalin had a totalitarian society, whereas in the authoritarian regime that took over this country during the McCarthy years, it affected many people, but not everybody. And of course, you go right down the list. But what that does is it mitigates it's intended, it seems to me, to mitigate one's outrage about the one thing that we can do something about. We were in this country. It was possible for us to resist those some people did resist, Bill, and that's the lesson, it seems to me.
Is an outrage at people who labored to enhance the reputation of the biggest mass murderer in the 20th century, namely Joseph Stalin. If we can't be outraged against them, why should we be outraged against Jim Crow? It isn't to say that Stalin is a greater evil than Dillinger. It's not to say that Dillinger is not evil. I grant you.
And if you're discussing
and nobody's asking you to
Dillinger,
write a
it
book
is
saying that Dillinger is less evil than Stalin.
right. And if you're discussing Dillinger, it is what Harry Truman called a red herring to drag Stalin into the argument.
The presence of Stalin is a presence that affects the calipers by which we make relevant. This is what you are saying.
Sure,
and these calibrations are necessary in order to to put this thing in scale.
Right. And as you know, in naming names, I talk about that.
This clip's a little longer. It's about 4 minutes.
Where he asked, is it
to go.
necessary when you talk about Stalin to talk about...
We'll probably go past 2:15 a bit, but it won't cut us off or anything. It's reductio ad absurdum, and it is a diversionary request. And ultimately, what it's designed to do is to take away from the basic question that this book asks, which is, what is there to be learned from the fact that during a time of trouble, hundreds of decent people did something which is indecent. Some resisted.
Okay, you should say one word because we don't have that much time left. My argument is with the accuracy of your book. Everyone you quote with approval is a left-winger. You look at the index of people you interview. I found 1 or 2 out of maybe 100 who could qualify as the other side. One of them is a man named, a law partner of mine named Tom Boland, who you say you interviewed. Now, he told me when you interviewed him, you then went ahead and told a story of a criminal case involving the magazine of which you are now the editor. Of course, you were not then. But you leave out the fact that the lawyer for that magazine was convicted by a jury of having forged and altered notes to cover up the part of the magazine in a key thing involving one of the trials of communist leaders in this country. Now, the book is full of this, from top to bottom. You don't give the other side an even shake here. You didn't talk to them. You didn't give them a chance. You didn't interview them. And you don't cite them.
David Court had the same problem in his book.
Of course. And that's quoted all through this book. This book is David. This is a minute.
Oh, actually, it's more like a minute. I forgot that there's the Panama clip after this, which we're not going to use because we don't have time.
Time is out. Thank you very much, Mr. Victor Levasky, the author, naming.
So we're about to go back.
Mr. Roy Cohn. Thank you, gentlemen, from the Bergen Catholic High School.
All right. One question that came up there. Heather, would you happen to know why was Roy Cohn at a podium?
Oh, this was a format that they experimented with in the 80s and I think a little bit in the 90s where in the early days, they had student questioners kind of sitting on a couch on the side, which was a huge step up because the audience was often sitting on the floor, maybe on pillows. It was pretty low rent set. And so they had some questioners on the side, including Jeff Greenfield, before he became a bigger star in regular news media. And then Buckley became concerned that he was having trouble finding students who were smart enough, basically. These college students were kind of disappointing him after Jeff Greenfield left the show. And so they thought, let's have what they called an examiner at a podium. Just one person who was a kind of professional in whatever area was being discussed, like the editor of a newspaper, or in this case, Roy Cohn. And they would do the Q&A at the end. There were other shows where they had the audience do Q&A, so there was a little bit of playing around with the format. And Navasky told me when I interviewed him that, you know, when he arrived for the show, he didn't know that Cohn was going to be the examiner. So it was a big, like, kind of thing, because Cohn, of course, was a notorious sort of pit bull kind of figure. And luckily, Navasky had debated him on radio before and had a little sense of some of his rhetorical devices and tricks. So he was prepared from that angle, but he didn't know he was going to be there. It's a terrific show, and once Cohn sort of jumps in from the side, it adds a lot of drama to it. It's just really good TV, and there are moments during the Q&A when not only is Navasky kind of shirking backwards because Cohn is being so aggressive and mean, but so is Buckley, who agrees with a lot of what Cohn is saying. But Cohn's manner is so abrasive compared to Buckley. So, you know, it's much less polite than Buckley. So he was only on the show a few times. He wasn't really the best examiner for Buckley to have, given his own style and taste.
Right. And It looked like they were sitting on pillows. I think you said pillows, right?
Yeah, the audience members, especially, the typical audience for Firing Line was a bunch of boys from a Catholic prep school in Staten Island or something. Sometimes you'd have a wider selection of guests, but often they would just call in a prep school, or they would, if they traveled to California, they would have Berkeley students sitting in the audience. Buckley liked to speak to youngsters in particular. He thought that, he had been foundational in helping to get Young Americans for Freedom off the ground, the conservative organization that was kind of supposed to be a counterbalance to the yippies and the counterculture and so on. And so it was kind of a natural for him to often invite high school students and college students to be in the audience.
Yeah, I wonder if you were at Berkeley today, would they riot?
Well, they'd have to know who he was.
Right.
So I'm not sure how much Buckley's in the minds of the average 20-year-old. Yeah, it's true. It's a tricky time for conservatives speaking on college campuses, and there's been a lot of brouhaha around that, hasn't there?
Yeah, definitely. Another question was, did they ever have audience participation?
Just a little bit. I think that Buckley wasn't comfortable with a total freeform kind of thing at the end. So there's some charming early episodes where I think there's one with Goldwater where this older lady stands up with cat's eye glasses and a pillbox hat and says, Mr. Buckley, I was a liberal, and now I've watched you, and now I'm a conservative, and thank you. And, so there's these moments of, the people in the audience. But Buckley preferred to have experts doing Q&A. I always say, he was a bit of an elitist, but he wasn't a snob per se. Some people would argue that because he loved his classical music and so on, but he was certainly an elitist, and so he was more comfortable having the experts, the authorities speaking, than just sort of random audience of people speaking.
Yeah, speaking of his classical music, I did want to include at the end there just a little bit of the ending credits so that we could hear the theme of the show, which was one of Bach's Brandenburg concertos, and he was a big Bach fan, right?
It's kind of amazing. I mean, when this show goes on the air, what are the theme songs on TV? Well, there's Gilligan's Island, there's the Brady Bunch. These are the expository theme songs about goofy sitcom families, and they're just, it's not really great music per se. And Buckley is really making a statement by choosing Bach, an excerpt from the Brandenburg concertos, as his theme song, right?
Right.
Mike,
and I did also want to talk about, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Heather has given a very good perspective and understanding of what the program itself was like. It might be interesting to some of the viewers what production of the program was like.
Yeah, tell us about that.
I'll give you an example. First, we started the program in Los Angeles with then Governor Reagan, and we did the program there. After the program was over, Governor Reagan told me that Bill Buckley had taught him everything he knew about conservatism. But after the program was over, Bill went to the South Pole. Warren and I went to Vietnam, went to Bangkok. And a few days later, Bill showed up there. And we went up and were having dinner on the rooftop hotel. And I looked across and I saw Jim Buckley. I said, Bill, isn't that your brother Jim? And he looked and said, by God, it is. He was at the South Pole with me. I didn't know he was coming to Saigon. That's the kind of thing that I'm just not familiar with. But we went from there to Israel and did a program with Golda Meir. And she, to let you know what it was, the relationship was with the guests on the program often, was she personally showed us around all the historic and religious sites, and then flew us down to the Panama Canal. But it's fascinating, the people you meet and the way that Buckley interacts with them, both on the program, but also when the program is over. But after that, after Israel, Warren and I went on back home. I don't know where Bill went. There's no telling. But it's an incredible trip. When we were in Saigon, we were on the way to the studio, and we heard this explosion, and the driver stopped and said, got on his radio and talked a minute, and he said, there's been a bomb set off at the studio. I'll take you back to the hotel. Bill said, no, let's go to the studio. Well, when we got there, we found that three of the Vietnamese crew had been killed, but they wanted to go ahead with the program.
Wow.
And so we did it. Ambassador Bunker showed up, but President Tu declined. So we did a second program with journalists that were there, which were always good programs because they gave you a different view from what the local political view was. They would cut through it and give you additional understanding of situations. But that's the way the program was done. And it was, he just insisted that everything be done professionally in the best way. When he sat down at that chair, you had 2 minutes to get the program going or else. And he just, all the while, very professional, but also very kind.
Well, I thought that we would wrap at 2:15, but we actually have a request to show our last clip. So anyone who wants to stay longer is welcome to do so. I am just going to, for anyone who needs to move on, I want to mention that we'd like to keep everyone updated about our upcoming screenings in the Get With the Program series. We're still kind of working out the dates and which shows are going to work. We may run into some rights issues here and there, so things aren't totally set yet. But if you sign up for the newsletter that we're starting to keep you informed, then you'll know what's going on. So I'm going to put the sign up link in the chat box, and if you're interested, just click that link and sign up, and we'll only be sending out 1 or 2 newsletters a month, probably no more than that. So please do that if you'd like to know what's coming up. Hopefully we're going to have some really great shows and conversations in coming months for the commemoration of the signing of the Public Broadcasting Act. So let's go to that last clip, and then we'll come back for a few more questions and wrap it up then. This is a very interesting episode, and one that Buckley said was one of his favorites, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we come back. This was an episode from 1978. It was a 2-hour special, and it was an episode in which Buckley was debating Ronald Reagan over whether the Senate at the time should ratify 2 proposed treaties regarding the Panama Canal. The issue at hand was whether Panama would regain control of the canal. Buckley was in favor of returning the canal to Panama, and Reagan was opposed in this debate. Unlike most episodes, this one was filmed outside of the studio, and it also has just a parade of political all-stars as guests. At this point in the event where we're going to pick up, Buckley and Reagan have just finished presenting their opening statements in the argument, and Senator Sam Ervin, who was chairing the debate, is who you're going to see speaking first.
Yeah, and he does like to do it because
This one's just like 2 minutes.
I like to filibuster myself and hate to see anybody stop and speak. But at this time, the chair will recognize.
Do you guys need to get anywhere, or are you good for time?
I'm fine.
Great.
7 minutes. 7 minutes? 7 minutes.
Well, Bill, my first question is, why haven't you already rushed across the room here to tell me that you've seen the light?
Afraid that if I came any closer to you, the force of my illumination would blind you.
All right. So what do we as a nation? We have run it at no profit. We have maintained the neutrality throughout the history of the canal. We have certainly vastly benefited Panama. What do we gain by making this change?
Well, what we gain by making this change, to quote myself, is increased security and increased self-esteem. I understand what you use in opposition, but I do think that since some of them are based on factual misconceptions, it would be useful to ask Ambassador Bunker
to straighten you out, if I'm.
We're about to go back.
Put it thus bluntly, on the matter of Romulo Escobar and our rights to guarantee access to the canal. And our rights to guarantee access to the canal.
All right, and we're back. A question from the audience, actually my colleague here at Current, Drew. What is Buckley's accent? New England?
That's a common question. People sometimes assume it was sort of put on, you know. In fact, when he had his 60-minute profile in 1980, right before Reagan was inaugurated, they asked him, you know, what's with all the big words? What's with that accent? And he said, look, you have to understand, this is how I speak to my dog. By which he meant, like, this is just how I talk. I can't help it. It's not put on. And ultimately what it came down to was that he had grown up in Connecticut. He had been sent to a British boarding school when he was, I can't remember, young, 10, 12, something like that. And his mother was undergoing a difficult pregnancy, and they thought they wanted to get him out of the country. It would be better. So he's at boarding school, and that's where the British intonations came into his speech. His first language was Spanish as a toddler, I guess. His nanny had been Spanish, and so he learned Spanish first, then English, then he picked up the British intonations, and it all kind of mixes together in this uniquely Buckley style of speaking.
Yeah, apparently I think it's sometimes called the Mid-Atlantic accent also. It's like the same. There was a question recently where I think maybe NPR had a story where someone had asked, why is it that, you know, stars of movies in the 40s sounded like they were British when they weren't.
And some of them were, but they had become Americanized. You know, someone like Ronald Colman. I mean, Buckley talks a little like Ronald Colman, right? It's got that kind of classic Hollywood actor voice of the 30s and 40s. Although there's the other side is the American sort of Gary Cooper, John Wayne kind of style. It's obviously not what he's doing.
Yeah. So Heather, when you and I were talking about excerpts to show, we talked about this one a bit, and you told me that it's a slog. I think that's the word you used.
Well,
it was really one of Buckley's favorite episodes.
You have to be a real Buckley nerd to sit through all the Panama Canal debate, or a Reagan nerd, I guess, or just a media history nerd. It's 2 hours. The second hour is stronger than the first hour. That's where things really pick up. I like it. It's just a really interesting moment where Reagan is about to run for president again. He's done it several times. He's failed. He's at an age where most politicians would be ready to retire. This is kind of his last hurrah, his last chance to be elected. And of course he is elected. And Buckley had been rooting for him for some time and felt this firing line episode was one of Buckley's 3 favorite episodes of the show that he often cited, and that he cited in his own book on firing line. And the other 2 were an episode with Malcolm Muggeridge talking about the nature of faith, and they actually ran that one every year at Christmas. And then the other episode that he loved was one with Solzhenitsyn, and it was actually a BBC interview with Solzhenitsyn that was then rebroadcast as a firing line episode with discussion at the end between Buckley and Malcolm Muggeridge and Bernard Levin. And I think he pointed to the Panama Canal as one of his favorites because it was so long, because it was a slog. It was so rigorous. It was so smart. It was so heavily researched. You know, it was like for him the best of sort of what cerebral TV could be. But also he felt that this was pivotal. That Reagan's stance on the Panama Canal was pivotal to his candidacy. That he had to oppose it. He had to oppose giving the canal back to the Panamanians to sort of maintain his conservative bona fides and maintain his base and grow his base and so on. But he had to lose that to Buckley's mind, and that he had to ultimately lose, and the canal had to go back to the Panamanians. Otherwise, there would be a kind of revolt in Panama, and he would look bad, and things would fall apart. So, to Buckley's mind, Reagan won by taking the correct conservative position in a certain way, but then he also won because the Panama Canal was returned to the Panamanians. Buckley was the odd man out as a conservative who wanted to give the canal back. I mean, it was him, Barry Goldwater, and John Wayne were the high-profile conservatives who were in favor of this and were seen as kind of nutty. And it's one of the very few issues that he disagreed with Reagan. The other was the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile treaty. Basically he had some trouble with Reagan's attempts at détente with Gorbachev were somewhat troubling to Buckley, who was a Cold Warrior to the very, very end.
Henry, did you have a role in that production?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I was at the Muggeridge production. It was in southern England, out in the sort of wild of southern England, if they can call it that. And they were in this little beautiful, and the Muggeridge had on his wall right behind him a picture of Mother Teresa, and he said, "That is my most valuable possession." And he felt so deeply about religion, and they had just a marvelous discussion that included lots of that. And,
all right. Well, I wish we had time to watch that one too. But again,
yeah.
that one is probably on YouTube along with all the other episodes from the Hoover Institution. So,
there was, Mike, there were a couple of other things. You never knew what Buckley was going to do. One time he called me when he was on the way to the studio from his southern home in Camden, South Carolina, and said, "Henry, I want to know who killed Cock Robin." I said, "What?" I said, "Bill, I'm sorry, I don't know, but I'll try to find out for you before you get here." And then another time he called me from Gustav, Switzerland, where we was there, where he writes his books in the summertime, and said, "Can I say goddamn on the program?" And I said, "Well, Bill, what's the context?" "Well, I'm quoting George McGovern." I said, "In that case, it's fine."
Yeah, that's funny. Anthony Burgess, the author of Clockwork Orange, used the F word on Firing Line. And I think it might be the first instance of the F word on American television. I could be wrong. I'm sure Warren Stivell, the producer, was just tearing his hair out worrying about FCC fines.
Did they bleep it, or were they?
They didn't bleep it. It must have been bleeped in some markets, but I've seen it unbleeped. Yeah.
Yeah. Boy, these days that would be that would be a major concern, probably, maybe more so than then even. With the FCC being so, it seems more unpredictable about how to handle profanity and obscenity these days. But anyway, I think that we are, we're over time, but it seems like most people stuck around with us, which is great. And I think that's really it. I really appreciate you, Heather and Henry, being here with us, answering these questions and telling us about Firing Line. It's been really fascinating. And again, we put a link to Heather's book in the chat box, so look that up. If you are at all interested in the show or in Buckley, I think you'd enjoy it. It's really well written, funny, and readable. And Henry, it's been great hearing more about the history of the show from you, so I really appreciate it. Thanks again to the Hoover Institution for allowing us to use the excerpts from the show, and to our friends at the Independent Television Service for help with the OVE platform that we've been using. Learn more about it and how your organization could use it at ovee.itvs.org. Again, sign up for our newsletter if you'd like to stay up to date on the upcoming screenings in this series. And thanks. See you next time. All right, we're done.
Great. Thank you, Mike.
Heather, it
Thank
was
you.
great getting a chance to meet you and hear you talk about Firing Line, somebody that really understands it. You don't find too many people like that.
Well, I was going to say the same thing to you, Henry. It was great to hear your stories and hear from someone who was really closely involved with the show. So I really appreciated it.
Yeah, Henry, I'm glad you were able to do it. You really added so much to it.
Well, thank you.
So
part of my life.
I believe this will be archived in some form. I'm going to figure out exactly how that works, and when we get it, I'll email a link to you guys in case you want it.
Oh, that would be great.
Yes,
thank you, Mike.
I'd love to have that.
All right, and just stay in touch. You know where to find me if you want to write about anything for us, if you have any questions, love to hear from you.
Okay.
Great.
Great.
All right.
Okay. Signing
Bye.
off. Bye.
Bye.
Here, I can put these right here. We all finished?
Yep.
All right.